by Andy Stanley called Future Family. If you haven't been with us, if you've missed a couple weeks or whatever, again, all of the messages are online in audio and video format. If you want to kind of check out where we've been and what we're talking about, you can download those and catch up easily. But we've talked about, first of all, we talked about the tension that we all live in the context of our families, that God holds out this ideal that seems so high and unattainable. And we live in the context, in our own reality in our family, and there's this huge gap between our reality and God's ideal, and there's this tension that we talked about managing. We looked also at the principle, the biblical principle that comes from the teaching of Jesus about mutual submission. And we kind of imagine what would it be like if every person in every family were kind of running around asking one another this question, what can I do to help? What can I do to help? Last week we looked at conflict and arguing, and we saw that according to the Bible, there's one reason why we all fight and we all argue, and that is I have desires that battle inside of me. And I don't get what I want. I want something, I'm not getting what I want, and so it spills out onto you, and we argue and we fight. Well, because oftentimes those arguments and those fights aren't resolved, it leads us to where we're going today, and that's something else many of us have in common when it comes to our families, and that is broken relationships. Alienation from certain family members, what many have called cutoffs. People that we have cut off from our family and cut out of our lives. And these broken relationships and these cutoffs, they can all come from different stories and different circumstances, but it all usually ends in the same place, that there are certain people in my family who I no longer have any kind of connection with or communication with because of what they've done to hurt me or what they've done to hurt people that I care about. And so it could be a sibling that, you've just cut off communication with that sibling because of things that happened when you were kids that were just so painful. And it's just too hard to go there, and it's just too hard to talk about it. And so you don't even try. It's easier just to not go there, and you haven't talked in like 12 years. Or it's a child who is maybe living a lifestyle that you don't approve of. And you had that conversation. You told them how you don't approve of their action or their behavior or their choices, and it ended in this big fight. And they walked out, and neither of you have made any kind of connection with one another ever since. It's a mother who, when you were growing up, was more interested in partying and drinking than she was in being a mom, and you spent most of your life mothering her. And you got tired of it, and you walked out, and you never looked back. And now she's making connection with you because she wants to know her grandkids, and you'll have nothing to do with her. There's so many situations and stories that lead to alienation from family members. Maybe your parents divorced when you were young, and the parent that you didn't live with didn't make any kind of effort to stay in contact with you, and that created anger and bitterness and resentment in you, and now your kids don't even know who grandma or grandpa so-and-so are, and they've been writing and they've been trying to get in contact, but you don't return their letters or their phone calls. Or your father was emotionally distant, and he never gave you the love and the approval your heart was so hungry for. Instead, he poured himself into his job or his friends or alcohol or a mistress. And again, that leads to just feelings of bitterness and anger and resentment, and you've just kind of written him off. It could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a sibling, it could be a cousin, it could be an uncle, it could be an aunt, it could be a grandparent. The point is, we've moved on. We're done. And every time we think about them or we're tempted to feel sorry or to miss them, we just kind of tell ourselves, you know what? I don't care anymore. I'm done with them. I'm done caring. I used to care, but caring didn't help. And so I just don't care anymore. And I'll tell you, that is one of the most dangerous things we could tell ourselves, is that we don't care anymore. Because family is many things, but family is not emotionally neutral. That we do care, that we are bound to the people that in our family by more than just blood, but that our emotions and our feelings are tied up with our families. And as much as we try to tell ourselves, I don't care, I do care. Because I was created to care. And so when your spouse tries to kind of get you to go there, and maybe they nudge you a little bit. Well, maybe you should give so-and-so a call. And you respond with, I'm not calling them. I just don't care anymore. And they're like, sheesh, if you don't care, why are you screaming? But it's because we do care. Because we were created to care. And the longer we leave those relationships broken, the longer we try to fool ourselves by telling ourselves that we don't care, the more damage is done to our hearts. You know, we can convince ourselves that we don't care for a while, especially when we're young. We can convince ourselves we don't care, like into our 20s, and then we have kids, and then we start thinking about so-and-so, and we kind of just shove that aside, and then we tell ourselves we don't care into our 30s, and then again we get those nudges, maybe you should call so-and-so, maybe you should write so-and-so, but every time that person comes up in conversation, we just change the subject. We remind ourselves, I don't care anymore. And then we get into our 40s, and we keep telling ourselves that we don't care, but then we feel this anger, and our hearts are out of alignment, and we're just getting angry at all the people around us, and they think it's them, and they don't know why we're angry, and we don't know why we're angry, and it's just something inside that's out of alignment. And if we continue to convince ourselves we don't care, eventually that person we don't care about dies. And then all of a sudden we realize we did care. And we wish we could just have 5 minutes to have that last conversation and resolve those issues that now seem like they weren't so big after all. You do care. You were created to care. And while this is true for every family member, I think it's especially true for our fathers. Now, moms, hold on. We love you. We know you'll always love us unconditionally, and you have a very special place in our hearts. But fathers have this ability to wound us in very, unique ways. Maybe they wound us intentionally or unintentionally. But we so often have strained relationships with our fathers, and we try to convince ourselves, you know what, just move on. I just don't care anymore. I've tried. I've gone there. I'm done. But the reality is you do care because you were created to care. And if you don't come to terms with that, there'll be consequences in your life. Let me tell you, I can relate well to this story. My father, and I want to be very clear, my father's not a villain. He is a good guy. He's one of the nicest, most patient men I know. But he was just uninvolved. And my parents divorced when I was 3, and he remarried by the time I was 5 and started a new family and had new kids. And he threw himself into his new family, apparently, from my perspective, at my expense. And while I would get the annual birthday card, there didn't seem to be a whole lot more effort to stay in touch and to connect. And I began to experience lots of anger and resentment. I didn't really know where it was coming from. But in the middle of my teen years, 14, 15 years old, I decided I was going to move in with my father, maybe get what I was looking for. But I began this period of just intense rebellion, making his life as miserable as I possibly could. And I did make his life miserable. But he took it, and he continued to take it. And that lasted for a year or two, and I moved back out, and we continued to have a strained relationship. In college, I ended up moving from the East Coast to Colorado, started my own family, got married, again, continued to have a strained relationship with my father. Then in seminary, I came to Christ, and I went to seminary, and I learned some things in seminary, and I discovered that I will never reach my full potential spiritually or emotionally unless I dealt with some of the things that I had in this relationship with my father. And I could tell myself I didn't care, but the reality was I did care because I was created to care. And so under the guidance of a spiritual mentor, I wrote a series of letters asking him to forgive me for some things that I had done to hurt him, letters explaining how he had hurt me. And through this process, and the process still continues, we were able to understand one another better. I was able to understand my father's limits much better, but we forgave each other. And we've come to work things out. And as a result of talking things out and working things out, we're at a place now where our relationship is better than it's ever been, where we talk regularly and we share our lives with one another. And that has meant so much to me because not only is our relationship better than ever, but I've been able to hear those things that I've always needed to hear. like, son, I'm so proud of you, of the person you become. I'm so proud of the father that you are. I'm so proud of the pastor and the leader that you are and the influence that you're having in other people's lives. And when you hear things like that from your father, again, no discredit to our mothers. But when you know that your dad's proud of you, you don't care what anyone else thinks. Because you care. Because you're created to care. So what do we do? What do we do with these relationships in our family, these people that we've been cut off from, people we've alienated ourselves from? Today we're going to try to address that question. And again, we're going to look at it in the context of family, but I hope you see that this is, again, a principle that will apply to any relationship in your life. If you have a Bible, open to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We're going to go to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is the second of an ancient letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to people living in this metropolitan city called Corinth. In Corinth, these young believers were facing a lot of the same complex questions and issues that we face in trying to be Christ followers in a very complex world. They were wondering, what difference should being a Christ follower make in my life? What difference should the cross of Christ make in my day-to-day life? Where do the teachings of Jesus intersect with my life today? They were dealing with these issues, and so Paul was writing these letters answering these very questions that we wrestle with today. And we're going to pick up one of those issues in the middle of a passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 14. Paul, again, he's starting in mid-thought here, but he says this. He says, "For Christ's love compels us." Okay, so before he tells us what he wants us to do or where he's going, he gives us a motive. He tells us why we're going to do what he's about to ask us to do. This is the reason we should be listening to him. And he says, Christ's love compels us. And I got to tell you, I just love this word compels. It's not used very often in the Scriptures. Other translations will use the word constrains. Christ's love constrains us. But in the Greek, this word in this context means to be claimed by something, to be totally controlled by something. In this case, the love of Christ. Christ's love has claimed us. Christ's love should be controlling us, and this was certainly the case in the Apostle Paul. He had experienced the love of Christ, and it completely controlled him, it completely constrained him, it completely reoriented his life from self to God. And he is saying this should be our experience as well. That we too should be compelled by, constrained by, controlled by the love of Christ. Because of Christ's love, we move from a self-focus to a God-focus. All right, he goes on. He says this, he says, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. Okay, so we kind of get that. So one died for all, we know that's probably talking about Jesus, right? He was the one who died for all. He died for all, okay? But because he died for all died. What in the world does that mean, that all died? And Paul kind of understands that maybe he said something that's a little confusing. He wants to make it clear, so he's going to say the same thing again, but in a different way as we move to verse 15. He says, and he who died for all, Christ, and he died for all, Christ, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them. I see now. So Jesus died for all, so that all can die, not physical deaths, but because he died for all, what that means is that we no longer live for ourselves. That's what it means to die in this context. I no longer live for me, but rather I live for him who died for me. And this is what it means to be compelled by the love of Christ. Because of what he has done for me, as exhibited in the cross and giving his life for me, because he died for me, that selfless act of love demands that I no longer live for myself, but I live for him. Christ's love compels us. It limits my choices. It focuses my attention. It eliminates options. It leads me, it compels me, it drives me to live a particular way. And so what this means is, if you are a follower of Christ, then what we're about to talk about, what Paul is about to say, is not an option. We have been compelled by the love of Christ. This is not an option. Now, if you're here today and you would say, you know what, I am not a Christian, I have not made that decision to follow Christ, then I got to tell you, you're off the hook on this one. You are off the hook, and you don't need to really listen to what is about to be said, because this is being compelled by the love of Christ. But you still may want to consider what is being said, because it is a beautiful, powerful thing in our lives. And really, I hope you would consider it, because, again, you were created to care. And the longer we tell ourselves we don't care, if we don't apply what we're about to talk about here, we do it at our own emotional and relational peril. But for those of us who have committed to following Christ, again, this is a non-negotiable. Christ's love for us, as demonstrated at the cross, makes it clear this is not a choice. We don't get to kind of like wonder about this. He did something for us that was really hard for him. And now he says, because of what I did for you, I want you to do something for me that may be really hard for you. What is this hard thing he wants us to do? All right, we'll get there. We're getting there. Verse 18, let's go there. And all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ. So Paul is continuing to make his point, and he says that we have been reconciled to Christ, to God, through the work of Christ. That when Jesus died on the cross, he did this work to kind of reconcile me to God. Now, this word reconcile and reconciliation, these aren't words we use a whole lot in our world today. Mostly we use it in the financial world, right? When we reconcile something, if you use Quicken, you got one of those magic buttons, reconcile. You just click that, and kind of all of our financial comes together. It's really nice how that works. But in this context, reconcile is more of a relational word. It's about people being reconciled, people being brought back together again. And the word is used again in 1 Corinthians, the first letter from Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verse 11. It gives us an example of what Paul was talking about. It says, a wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does separate from her husband, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And so this gives us a sense of what reconciliation means. It means two people who were once one, husband and wife, they were alienated, they were separated. But if they're reconciled, that means that the two are brought back together again into one. That relationship is restored. And this is exactly what God has done for us through Christ. That he reconciled us to himself, where once we were alienated, he brought us back together through the work of Christ. We'll come back to this, but Paul goes on in 2 Corinthians. We're back to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Here we go. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So God reconciled us to himself through Christ, and now he is giving us this ministry of reconciliation as well. That we would not only be reconciled to him and help others be reconciled to him, but we would be reconciled with one another as well. And we have no idea what God is asking us to do here until we really understand what God did for us. We don't understand how hard of a thing it is God is asking us to do here until we understand how hard of a thing it was for God to do. Think this through with me. Who reconciled reconciliation between God and us? It was God, right? God initiated reconciliation. He took the first step. He made the first move. He took all of the responsibility, even though it was my sin that was separating me from him. Even though I was the one who caused all the problems, even though I had rebelled against him, even though I had offended him, even though I had snubbed my nose at him, I was guilty. He still was the one who initiated and pursued reconciliation with me. I was at odds with him. And he took the initiative to make things right with me. And why would he do that? One word, right? Love. How many times does the New Testament say it? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that he initiated this act of reconciliation. Or again, Romans chapter 5, verse 8. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While I was rebelling against God, while I was alienated from God, while I was doing, everything that he didn't want me to do, God gave his son and died. He died for me. So he initiated reconciliation, even though I was the guilty party. And he did it because of his sacrificial love. And what did it cost him? It cost him his life. It was no cheap amount that he paid. He paid with his very life. He sacrificed his life to make things right with me, even though I was the one to turn my back on him. And so, reconciliation means that God has removed every obstacle in the universe that stands between you and him, between healthy relationship between you and him. God has taken care of it all. He initiated it. He did it. He paid for it. He did it in love. You now, there's nothing in the universe barring you from 100% pure, unadulterated relationship with God except you. Right? That's the one obstacle God would not remove. And it's not your sin, as we'll see in a minute. He's already dealt with that. But it's your choice. He won't take your choice. And so here's God standing arms open wide. I've done it all. I want relationship with you. I've done everything to get us reconciled, to bring us back into relationship with one another. All you have to do is say yes. All you have to do is choose. And once we do, we are brought back into perfect relationship with God because of what Christ has done. And once we do, God gives us this ministry. He gives us this ministry of reconciliation. He says, now that you're reconciled to me, help others be reconciled to me, and you reconcile with the people around you. And I'll tell you, this is something completely new for many of us when we come to Christ. A lot of times, when we come to Christ, people don't explain this to us. That this is going to be our responsibility, to be agents of, ministers of reconciliation. Because this isn't the way we operate. This isn't the way we deal with one another relationally, right? I mean, the way we typically handle broken relationship is, I was right and you were wrong. And if you want a relationship with me again, do something about it. And if you do it good enough, maybe we can have restored relationship. But I'm the right one. And then the problem is you have two people both saying, I was right, they were wrong. No. And then they never come back together. If we're alienated, you do something. You make the first move. I'm not making the first move. Or maybe I have a little bit of fault, and if, maybe we can come halfway. I mean, the best case scenario, maybe that's kind of where we go. We'll come halfway. I have something wrong here, you have some wrong here, we both have fault, let's go halfway. But for the Christ follower, because of Christ's compelling love, we are called to be agents of this message of reconciliation to every person and in every relationship. Now, again, maybe no one ever explained this to you when you first started following Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, this may be the one thing that will keep you from ever following Christ. Because you're like, you know what? That's no way. I am not going to be that person that's just going around making peace with everybody when they're the ones wronging me. But this is what we are to become when we become Christ followers. Agents of reconciliation. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are probably thinking about those cases of physical abuse and sexual abuse. And you're thinking to yourself, you're telling me I'm supposed to be like best friends with the person who did those horrible things to me? Does God expect me to put myself in that position again? And let me just hear me say very clearly, we need to be wise. Okay? Not every relationship can be fully reconciled. I'm not talking about anybody putting themselves in a position where they're going to be in danger. I mean, we're smart people. We can work this out. We can figure out what reconciliation looks like in every relationship. If you'd like to talk through a circumstance, I'd love to kind of work through that with you. But we are called to be agents of reconciliation. And Paul continues in verse 19 where he says this, if I can get it here. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. So Paul continues to build his argument, and he says one of the most profound things, I think, in all of the Bible, that God was not counting men's or humanity's or our sins against us. Again, this is one of the most profound ideas in all of the Bible. It is one of the most deep ideas you can get in the context of family relationship, that God was not counting our sin against us. And now that's not the way a lot of people think about God. We think, well, God is certainly counting my sins, Because he wants to hold them against me, because that's what God does, right? I mean, that's God's job, is to hold my sins against me. But that's not what he did. Even though we had this long list of sins that were against him, that were separating us from him, that God would take those things and he would set them aside. And he would say, I'm not going to let anything keep me from my work of reconciliation. I'm going to put all of your sin aside. And so what this is saying, and some translations will actually say it like this, is that in spite of our sin, God reconciled us to himself. In spite of what I had done wrong, in spite of my rebellion against him, in spite of my sin, God reconciled me. And then it says at the end of verse 19, a little help please. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. So, let's put this all together. There's one more part of the passage, that we are, therefore, Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. So just imagine that, you're God's ambassador. So now, we'll put this all together. All right, so God reconciled us to him in spite of our sin. In spite of our sin. He didn't count our sin against us. Isn't that great news? That's great news, isn't it? In spite of our sin, we're reconciled to God. Now, the not so great news. He expects us to do the same thing for one another. That we would reconcile to one another in spite of our sin. But you know what? Again, that's not good news, because we are alienated from family members because of their sin. It's because of what they did to me that I'm alienated. It's because of what they didn't give me. It's because of the fact that they walked out on me that we're alienated, and we cut them off in the first place. It's because of the fact they didn't give me what I needed emotionally. It's because they were selfish. It's because they were abrasive or abusive. It's because they had abandoned me. It's because they hurt me. It's because they offended me. It's because they didn't give me what I wanted or didn't act the way I wanted. It's because I wasn't getting what I wanted that we no longer have relationship. But listen, in the same way that God reconciled us to himself in spite of our sin, we are to be reconciled with each other in spite of their sin and mistakes. And we say, no. It's because of. And so we need to really think through what we're saying here when we live this way. When we receive oneness with God and reconciliation with God in spite of our sin, and we receive that grace, but we live our lives with one another, we say, you know what? But I can't forgive them because of, I can't have a relationship with them because of. What we're saying is that we have a higher standard than God. And maybe God can overlook sin, but I can't. And we're receiving something from God that we're unwilling to give to one another. And then we tell ourselves, you know what? I don't care. But you do care. Because you were created to care. Let's look at these commandments, these powerful statements. And just this one short passage we just looked at. God gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Paul goes on. He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. And again, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. I mean, could it be any more clear? His love compelled him to do something hard for us. And he did it in spite of our sin. And now we no longer live for ourselves, but we live for him who died for us. And his love now compels us to be reconciled with one another in spite of their sin. Now, again, I know this is hard, and I know there's probably lots of reasons you can think of as to why we shouldn't do that, or why particularly you shouldn't do that. You know, maybe you're telling yourself, you know what, it sounds good on paper, but it just wouldn't work. If you knew my situation, you would know it just won't work. And I would say, you may be right. You know what? Jesus knew that when he gave his life for us, it wouldn't work for everybody. That only certain people, only some people would receive the gift that he was dying to give them. And others would say, no, that's not going to work for me. But he did it anyway. And so as we tell ourselves it just may not work, well, it didn't work for Jesus either. And more than that, I would say, you know what? I think it will work. It may not work for the other person, but I believe it will do a work in you. As you begin to reconcile with the people around you, something's going to happen inside of you. The Spirit of God is going to move, and you're going to feel things breaking free in your heart that you maybe had a log jam, and you're going to experience God's Spirit working in you. Others may say, well, you know what? The issues between me and this person are so complicated. You know what? It would take years to work through all those issues, and so I just don't think that this is going to work for us. But you know what? This isn't about resolving issues. This is about just reconnecting relationally. Maybe the issues need to be ignored, like forever. Maybe you'll never get to working through the issues. It's just about sending that first email. Hey, how are you doing? I've been thinking about you. Sending that first card, maybe a picture of your family. You know, you've been on my mind. It's just about making that connection. Again, the issues may not get resolved. This isn't about working out the issues. Jesus did not work out the issues with us before he reconciled us to himself. He reconciles us to himself, and then the issues slowly, over a lifetime, get worked out. Or finally, another common objective would be, you know what? If I reestablish a relationship with that person, while they're doing what they're doing and living the way they're living and making the choices that they're making, I will be condoning what they're doing and how they're living. Or I will be condoning their action and how they hurt me. And so if I don't demand an apology from them before reconciling, I'm condoning their action. But you know that's not true. You know, how many people do you hang out with that you agree with everything they do? You know, we have relationships with people, we don't agree with things that they do. Doesn't mean we're condoning it. As a matter of fact, Jesus hung out with lots of people. He didn't condone what they did. He didn't accept their behavior, but he accepted them and he loved them and he was in relationship with them. And so if you will reestablish relationship with people that maybe you don't think they're doing what they're not doing what you think they should be doing, you will be more like Jesus than you even thought possible. Because that's exactly what he did. Who in your life have you been staying away from because of their sin? Now, whose name comes to your mind as we're talking about this? Whose face comes to mind? I mean, who in your family, extended family, have you been trying to tell yourself, you know what, I just don't care? You know, Paul is making a very compelling argument here, and I'm going to kind of join him here. But in a minute or two, you're going to walk out these doors. We're going to be done, I promise, in a minute or two. You're going to walk out, and you know what? Nothing in your life will have changed. You will have heard this, and you'll think, wow, that would probably be good if I did it. But you can walk out so easily and never do anything. And so I'm going to ask you to do something today. It's a little unusual, but I hope you understand why. Because this is so incredibly important that we get this right. So incredibly important for your health, for your relationship with God, for your relationship with others, so that you could reach your full potential spiritually and emotionally. I'm going to ask you this week to make contact, to make a bold move and make contact with that person, whether it's an email or a card or a phone call. And you don't have to work out all the issues. You don't have to talk out all the issues, but just say, hey, I've been thinking about you. And before you do that, I'm going to ask you to make your first move this morning, your first bold move this morning. And in a minute, if you know who you need to contact, if you see a face, if you know a name, I'm going to ask you to stand up. You may say, well, why in the world would I do that? Let me tell you why. First of all, because it is so easy that we just kind of have good intentions to do these things we hear on Sabbath morning. And if you've been in church at all, you know how often you walk out those doors and say, wow, what a great message. I need to live that, and then you don't. Right? And we don't want this to be one of those messages where you're going to walk out and say, I will, but you don't. And so I'm going to ask you to make your first bold move today by standing up. Something in your heart's going to happen when you stand up. If you could do that first bold move, then you can do the second bold move of then contacting them later this week. Second reason I'm going to ask you to stand up is so that you can see that you're not alone. That this is an issue many of us are dealing with, and we don't have to do that alone. We're not alone. We're on this road together. And finally, I'm going to ask you to stand so we can cheer for you. Because what you're going to do is going to be a very bold thing. It's going to be a very Christ-like thing. You're going to be reconciling with somebody, and we just want to have the opportunity to say, hey, way to go. We're so glad that God is working in your life and is going to work through you to bring reconciliation to somebody who you've been alienated from. Okay? So can we do that? If you know who it is that you're thinking of, you have a face, you have a name, someone that you're going to contact this week, would you just stand right now? Just go ahead. We just want to cheer for you. Look at that. Isn't that awesome? Come on. Keep standing. Yeah. Go ahead. Don't let this moment pass. You know that person? All right. Let's all stand together.